Now, as we all know, the conflict in Afghanistan is occurring within a religious narrative, as the Taliban and al-Qaeda both espouse religious worldviews to justify their ambitions. However, much of the U.S. foreign policy establishment seems to view the role of religion as irrelevant or almost so. For instance, nowhere in the 2010 Afghan and Pakistan regional stabilization strategy does the word religion appear. Considering that South Asia is one of the most religious regions of the world, it is troubling that U.S. policymakers accord it no role or consideration in their planning. The Norwegian Peacebuilding Center reported this summer, actually, here at Georgetown, about how religious moderates in Afghanistan are being forced to the political margins or cowed into silence by violence. Many of these religious leaders likely fear prosecution, imprisonment, and possible execution for statements that some would consider blasphemous. With this occurring, religious extremists have been able to dominate the discussion about religion and politics and have pulled Afghanistan further towards the very groups the U.S. intervened against. Some in the U.S. government are becoming sensitive to this. American Rear Admiral Gregory Smith, who's the chief spokesman for NATO, was quoted in the Washington Post in October saying that the Taliban has co-opted the religious narrative for years. To counter this, the United States needs to incorporate a greater awareness of the religious dynamic into our strategy. And specifically, I would suggest that we need to consider how we augment our counterinsurgency efforts. Counterinsurgency focuses on the concept of population-centric warfare and protecting the population. Now, some interesting points about counterinsurgency methodologies. The Counterinsurgency Field Manual for the U.S. Army Marines focuses on winning the hearts and minds of the majority of the population. The manual outlines tactics for pulling away the uncommitted middle from the irreconcilable insurgents into the orbit of the government. And it highlights how religious leaders and communities should be targeted for such outreach. Since legitimacy is the main objective, bringing their influence alongside that of the government will bolster its standing in the eyes of the countrymen and further facilitate reconciliation. However, from my reading of the manual and from what I've seen of discussions on these strategies, none of them contemplate the consequence of pulling neo-Taliban religious leaders into the fold of Kabul. There's a real danger here. The weak and weakly secular Afghan government cannot withstand the pressure religious leaders can bring to bear on social and political issues. The outcome is that the government moves to accommodate their views, becoming more religious and less secular, more rigid and less accommodating. This is happening already. In the early fall, the 350-member government-backed Ulama Council voted to demand that President Karzai implement Sharia law. This is alarming because if it was implemented, it would be a major reversal of progress on human rights and democracy since the fall of the Taliban. So if these forces remain unaddressed, there's a real possibility that the blood and treasure spent by the United States to oust the Taliban could ultimately result in the reestablishment of neo-Taliban rule. Therefore, part of the answer to prevent violent religious extremists from dominating the debate on religious matters is by allowing and protecting other Islamic perspectives. Creating a civic space in Afghanistan where different religious interpretations can be shared and debated on a variety of critical issues, both religious and political, can give politically moderate religious leaders the critical oxygen they need to survive. Call this supporting religious freedom or creating civic space for Muslims, but either way it would counter extremism. The opening of this civic space could help displace Taliban influence from social networks by creating opportunities for peaceful religious debate, alternative views, and pluralism. New voices could emerge with alternative and less violent interpretations of Islam, and this could supplant the insurgents' religious views that hold sway over the population, helping lead to their marginalization and denying them a popular base in the Islamic faith. In short, you could call this population-centric warfare by promoting religious freedom. But for this to work, there need to be a recalibration of U.S. policies to make creating civic space for religious groups a priority. The U.S. government needn't play necessarily a public role, but could put its thumb on the scales to ensure that politically moderate religious leaders can successfully engage in the political religious scene. Concerns about getting it wrong and having it backfire are legitimate, but America is a religious country with smart people who know how to gauge sensitively. So I would suggest two interconnected approaches, one empowering actors on the ground and one that exposes Afghanis to outside experts and new information. So in this regard, some possible activities could include, first, bolstering the position of Afghans who advocate respect for human rights and tolerance. Steps can be taken to amplify the voices of politically moderate religious leaders, political reformers, and human rights defenders. This can be done privately by encouraging President Karzai to appoint these individuals to the country's Human Rights Commission, government positions, court system, various ulama councils, and jirgas. Secondly, ensure inclusive reconciliation talks. In September, President Karzai established a committee that will attempt to broker a peace deal with the Taliban and other insurgents. Members of this committee include warlords, clerics described as pro-government, tribal elders, and a handful of women. With frequent news stories about ongoing overtures to the Taliban and the contours of a grand bargain possibly emerging soon, now is the time to ensure that politically moderate religious leaders, representatives of civil society, including Shia Muslims, members of other religious and ethnic minorities, and women, are included in the reconciliation talks, and that any reconciliation process doesn't provide immunity to known human rights violators. Thirdly, I'd suggest that we should work to expose Afghan religious leaders to other models of mosque-state relations. The U.S. government can facilitate trips through the International Visitors Program to the United States to show how we have dealt with issues of church-state relations. We could also increase people-to-people exchanges, or maybe even priest-to-priest. If it's difficult to bring Afghan religious leaders out, let's take Americans in. The Special Envoy Hussein mentioned briefly his trip to Afghanistan. I heard very positive things about it, the way he was able to engage religious leaders, government officials, civil society representatives. So other U.S. officials with a religion portfolio should also visit, like the Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom, the Special Representative to Muslim Communities, the Special Envoy for Anti-Semitism, and commissioners from USCIRF. And lastly, education. Our policymakers need to ensure that programs administered by USAID help develop primary and secondary education, such as through the printing of textbooks that incorporates freedom of religion or belief and religious tolerance. So in the few minutes I have remaining, how do we do this? To have impact, it must be a whole of government response coordinated at the highest levels and not approached piecemeal. There is no silver bullet that can change the course of the conflict, but a range of coordinated activities could begin to push our adversaries off balance and create counter-narratives and help bring about success over the long haul. So a few suggestions and ideas to consider. One is to ensure high-level coordination. If we're going to have a whole of government response, there's got to be the point person. Right now we have this ad hoc array of offices and envoys on religion issues operating without any strategic guidance or framework. Staffing a senior position to pull these disparate efforts into a synchronized effort would be very positive. It could come out of Ambassador Holbrooke's office, or it could come out of the NSC. The International Religious Freedom Act actually authorized the staffing of an NSC position to work on religious freedom issues, so the authorities already exist. We also need to work to increase the State Department's ability to understand religion. For 10 years, we've had the small Office of International Religious Freedom. It's done very good reporting on issues relating to religion and society and violations against religious freedom. Under the Obama administration, it's also expanded to include religious engagement. But to make it more effective, we should think about elevating it to the Secretary's office, as many think the International Religious Freedom Act intended, or perhaps the Undersecretary for Global Affairs. The staff should also be expanded so it can meet these new burdens and have an expeditionary capacity. One element to think about is the Chaplaincy Corps. A new doctrine was established last year on religious leader engagement through the issuance of Joint Publication 105 for Religious Affairs and Joint Operations. And this gives commanders in the field the option of using chaplains to engage religious leaders in their area of responsibility. Chaplains have the potential to give commanders an understanding of the needs of local communities on these complex battlefields from a religious perspective while not violating their non-combatant status. And if chaplains are resourced and properly trained for this new mission, I think it could become a real asset. Another suggestion would be ensuring that U.S. personnel have a better understanding of the religious dynamics on the ground. The Foreign Service Institute and the various professional military education schools should consider increasing their teaching on religion and religious freedom before U.S. personnel are deployed. Through better trained State Department and military officials, the improved religious IQ of the U.S. government could lead to an enhanced understanding of the role specific religious leaders play. These better trained officials could join human trained teams and PRTs to help them evaluate the statements and actions to determine who supports the ISAF mission. More than an anthropological approach that views religion as an artifact, these individuals could give the United States a tactical sense of the religious terrain that would feed into an overarching strategy of creating civic space by supporting those who oppose violent extremism. And then lastly, engaging in theater. In the context of increased military activity by the United States and ISAF, the U.S. should work to ensure that any engagement or partnership with Afghan religious leaders is mindful of the religious dynamic and international standards on religious freedom. There's been some good work started down at CENTCOM with the AFPAC Center of Excellence and the CENTCOM chaplain. And more could be done with increased public diplomacy efforts, programming through Voice of America to increase discussions about religion and society. So in conclusion, nothing really focuses the mind like being shot at, and nothing stirs up passions as much as talk of religion. The Taliban successfully mixes these two to win the hearts and minds of the various Afghan tribes or to force them into submission. In this context, the United States must engage the negative religious narrative that the Taliban forces on the populace while honoring our commitment to religious freedom, both in our Constitution and international law. Promoting religious freedom can bolster our national security goals and needs to be at the center of U.S. government activity. We've often said at the Commission that religious freedom is the canary in the coal mine for human rights abuses, and this is certainly the case in Afghanistan. Engaging smartly can delegitimize the Taliban narrative and legitimize other voices in Afghan society. Doing nothing cedes too much to insurgents and positions them to shape the contours of that society in ways antithetical to U.S. long-term and national security and democracy goals. Thank you.